I'm a fan of American jazz, and integrating of jazz with symphony in Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue has long riveted my personal attention towards an open and innovative U.S. However, America's popular culture may suffer a major setback as President Trump goes against globalization, which part represents the real U.S. that attracts thousands of immigrants each year. And why has this country become so divided? This rediscovery trip will take me to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. I'll be talking to people from governments, think tanks, and universities and trying to figure out where the China-U.S. relationship is headed.
We must recognize the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. We will have differences in the future.
40 years of engagement have brought us to this security dilemma between a rising power and a residing superpower. Should they be interdependent or separated? Are they systematic rivals or strategic competitors by nature? What challenges might hostile coexistence entail for each and for all? A week-long trip took us to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. We talked to analysts and experts and survived a journey of mutual scrutiny and rediscovery. No easy job, as U.S.-China ties have hit a rocky patch and the new relationship has not yet been defined clearly. Minimal engagement, perhaps, but changes in the power equation might help redefine a new world order. So join us in this journey of rediscovery only on Dialogue with Yang Rui. Surprisingly, our CGTN crew got American visas easily, and the trip to the D.C. was fruitful. My interview with Jorge Hanna, former Chilean ambassador to China in front of Capitol Hill, was blessed with the sunshine and substantiated with a Latin definition of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's such a great honor to have you on our program here in Washington, the political heartland not only of the United States, but perhaps to a large degree for the rest of the world, ironically. Now, it doesn't come as a surprise, Mr. Ambassador, that most of the think tanks and their policy discussions would focus on China. But tell me, frankly, what does the rise of China actually mean?
Well, it doesn't mean the end of the world, of course. But let me tell you this story. Before coming to Washington from Beijing, I was told that all conversations in Washington start with whatever they're going to start. But they always end with one question. What is China going to do about this? I was very skeptical that that was going to be the case. I've lived in Washington on a number of occasions. This is a very self-centered town. And I thought, why would they be so concerned about a faraway country like China? But I've discovered it is true. Much of the policy debates in Washington today are around China, what China will do, what is going to happen with the trade differences, the so-called trade war between China and the United States. The negotiations are still going on, and what will happen afterward. So, a lot of think tanks are looking at that, and obviously the government is very much looking at that as well.
Mr. Ambassador, Americans tend to look at things in black and white terms as what they did during the Cold War. However, we have a Chinese saying, 当局者迷，旁观者清. It means, in English, those who are inside the game would not have a clear picture or a complete picture about what is going on. It is those outsiders, they could develop a much more clearer picture about the true realities. So you are an observer from a third party who is able to follow the evolution of the bilateral relationship very closely. So what do you think of the real substance, the real stuffs?
There is no doubt that the two largest economies in the world today are the United States, which is the biggest, and the second, of course, is China. And there's a strong element of competition there that is part of the nature of how things are. You know. That said, the current trade differences, seem to me, illustrate the problems of these two great powers as they are. You know, I'm sure you have heard the expression about the Thucydides trap, you know, in the notion that when there is a rising power, as was, you know, Germany in the early part of the 20th century, and it clashed with the United Kingdom. The notion being that something similar may be happening here. I would say that there's a lot of consciousness about that and the need to avoid it. So my take is, it's important to take one thing at a time. My concern right now is that the trade differences be resolved. It seemed to me if that happens, we would have gone a long way. There are other issues that will be obviously taken up afterwards, but it's important to strike up one win, as it were, on that particular front. And I guess what negotiators will do and government officials will do, they'll take it from there.
It doesn't come as a surprise that the United States would always assume a world leadership. Here are two questions about their suspicions on the impact of China's rise. First of all, BRI. They accuse China of trying to rebuild the world order and to replace U.S. world leadership. So do you think their concerns have any water or have any ring of truth? What do you think?
Well, I will say this. There is a real problem in terms of infrastructure deficit and connectivity deficit in the global south. And it seems to me what BRI is doing is addressing that. Now, why do we have this deficit? We have this deficit, among other things, because entities like the World Bank and northern powers have long ceased to invest in infrastructure in the global south. You know, in the 60s and 70s, dams and highways and railways used to be big international projects. No longer. You know, entities like the World Bank are focusing on so-called soft development issues, health, education, poverty alleviation. But there is this big deficit. The Inter-American Development Bank has just released a report about the infrastructure deficit in Latin America, which is very big. So we have a problem. And to that problem, China says we have a solution, which is BRI, you know. So the notion that somehow this is a bad thing is not something that people in Latin America buy. How can it be a bad thing to build bridges, to build highways, to build railways? No? So it seems to me that BRI has struck a chord, has come at the right moment, and it has found quite a bit of resonance in Latin America and elsewhere in the global south.
It could be part of a wishful thinking that there are 50 shades between the former Soviet Union and what China currently stands for in terms of major power politics. Let's look at 5G. Now, unlike what the United States had done to the former Soviet Union, which disintegrated in the year 1991, the United States simply wants to keep China down, but not necessarily out. For the former Soviet Union, it's a matter of a zero-sum game. I win, you absolutely lose. And therefore, they want to keep China trailing behind the United States for at least 2 decades, if not 3 decades, in terms of 5G and digital technology. Is that a mission possible?
Well, you know, the way I see it, you know, you cannot ask countries not to develop their own technology, not to invest in R&D, not to develop better scientific capabilities. I mean, to me, that is a bit of a non-starter. You can have arguments, it seems to me, about the role of SOEs. You can have arguments about, you know, the trade deficit. But to ask countries not to invest in R&D, in scientific research, in the development of technology. I mean, let me give you one example. One area in which China now is developing quite an edge over the United States is artificial intelligence. You know? And that, of course, is very much at the cutting edge, you know, of economic development today. So the notion that China should somehow cut back on investing in AI, you know, is not really realistic.
A second look at the idea of a BRI. I mean, observers, the international observers may have different interpretations. They may say, those from the West would argue, look, this is a conspiracy theory. It intends to build that tribe. But others would look at what China does in Central and Eastern European countries, like the 16+1 mechanism. Italy, in the latest development, agreed to sign up for the Memorandum of Understanding regarding BRI. That reminds us of what the UK did to join the AIIB.
Oh.
Chile is a so important business partner in Latin America, and you also agreed to be part of BRI. So how difficult it is for the United States, for example, to say, hey, you either take side with us or you'll be on the wrong side of history?
Well, my point is the following. We live today in a globalized world. You know? And in this globalized world, you cannot tell countries that depend very much on their exports, do not trade with this country, do not trade with this other, do not attract investment from this country, or do not attract in other country. You know? This is not the way the world works. This is not the way the world economy works. So it seems to me that what we have to agree on is that Well, there is something called free trade. There is something called open economies. And the consequence of that is that countries buy and sell in the global market. And there is no way of getting around that. We in Chile believe very strongly in free trade. One reason we have the most developed economy in Latin America is because we have signed 26 free trade agreements with 65 countries. And as a result of that, we do $42 billion worth of trade with China, with whom we signed a free trade agreement in 2005, and we now have a 2.0 version signed in 2017. So this is the way forward. It's free trade, not managed trade.
Congratulations on the dividends of your FTA with so many business partners around the world. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
My discussion with the ambassador was very fruitful and enjoyable, and covered the sort of issues that come up again and again. I put related questions to some of our other guests.
What worries me the most right now is when I look at these freedom of navigation operations that the United States is running in the South China Sea. In one of the recent confrontations, the Chinese warships and the American ships missed by each other by 45 yards. Had there been a collision there and people been killed, there could have been military conflict. I am very much worried because there are people in the United States who would welcome a military confrontation with China. Throughout the Cold War, there were American generals and others who welcomed a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. What they said at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that this is the biggest advantage the United States is going to have over the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union is closing the gap. We should go to war now when we can defeat them easily and handily. There are people, I'm afraid, and I can't tell you who, but there are people in the United States who I think have the same attitude toward China now. And we look at the Boltons, and we look at the Pompeos, and the Navarros and others, and they have a militaristic view of the world. It was Bolton who wanted to bomb Korea, Bolton who wants to bomb Iran. I mean, most of these people now are more focused on Iran, but there's a strong contingent there who see China as an enemy and think that the United States now has an advantage, and we've got to take advantage of it.
Trump's and actual administration gave the different scenario and to the different people. Even my friends in the university in the United States, they have the different scenario to see what is Trump's done. And I hope that Trump, in his presidency, he wants to make a difference. He wants to contribute to his country. This is fine. But he actually should know what is happening. The globalization can be just talking about. We should be and understand this is kind of a trend.
There's a debate in my field on whether extensive economic interdependence is a cause of peace or a cause of conflict. And one view is that economic interdependence gives lots of incentives to continue peaceful relations because it's too expensive to disrupt this cooperation, especially for a country like China, whose entire rise to a position of wealth and power has come from plugging its economy into the liberal world economic order and participating in those economic institutions that the liberal democracies have created. It would seem very unwise to want to turn away from this cooperation. On the other hand, interdependence is just another word for mutual vulnerability. And when countries start to believe that their interdependence is at risk because one side is trying to exploit the other, or because it looks like one side is going to pull back from interdependence and leave its trading partner in the lurch, then people start to think about, well, I need to prepare myself unilaterally to be safe and strategically aligned and secure for the world that might be coming. So in situations where you have two very strong great powers, especially where one is rising relative to the other, this is a situation we've seen in history a number of times before. The one time that there was this kind of a power shift, power transition between two large poles in international affairs where things worked out smoothly was the United States surpassing Great Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. And what made that possible was not just interdependence, but that the social and economic and legal systems of the two countries were very similar in how they were organized. And everybody felt that the emergence of the United States as a leader of the international system that was even stronger than Great Britain would not be disruptive, was that they were seen as having the same ways of operating in politics, economics, and society, and many of the same values, the kind of values that I've been calling modern values.
As a descendant of the Nixon family, what do you think of the possibility that we would go back to the Cold War, given the current mounting tensions between the two biggest economies?
I would say that it's an impossibility to go back to the tension of the Cold War. China and the United States, their economies are too interconnected for us to risk going back to a Cold War. So that wouldn't be in the interest of either country. So I think it's highly unlikely. But I also think from another perspective that we have such a bright future in front of us if we can work out some of the differences that we have, and I think we're on the path to doing that. I think that we will see that the United States and China can have an even brighter future for the next 40 years than the past 40 years. Because I really believe that the Chinese people and the American people, we have so many similarities. We come from big countries, very productive countries. We have a lot in common. And so I think that the people of each country won't let another Cold War happen.
I think there's the statements going back to Cold War is not accurate. You know, in the Cold War area, the total trade volume between Russia, former Soviet Union, and the United States, maybe $4 billion, $5 billion US dollars. But here today, you study maybe $600 billion US dollars. You know, so there's no way you can go back to ideological confrontations, on military confrontations. You know, so to the old days in 1950s. But the danger is for American people, as Ambassador Borka says, you know, as chronic moments, you know, afraid of this when former Russian launched their satellites, the American has sense of urgency, sense of crisis, you know. So, and what I use at this conference, I encourage two countries have some kind of a smart competition. I used to define the U.S.-China relation in 4 dimensions: very broad contact, people to people. You know, so every year 5 million people go back and forth. Chinese people, American people understand each other, you know. So, and I think the second dimension is called substantial cooperation. We have a lot of economic programs going on, even diplomatic cooperation on Syria and DPRK issues. And the third dimension is, you know, competition, right? And the real competition, between Huawei and iPhone, you know, between the diplomatic, strategic competition on South China Sea, on South Asian people, trying to win heart and mind. You know, the United States also trying to invest, working out Indo-Pacific strategy. The last dimension I used to call it limited confrontation, but now I'm more worried about the expanded confrontation. So in this new period of time, I would encourage two governments think about smart competition. Don't be afraid of competition. Have some kind of a 正能量, so positive kind of a sense of competition. That will help each country, right?
Well, remember, the big characteristic of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was that there was no economic engagement between those two. None. Secondly, in third countries, they were fighting proxy wars all the time. In Latin America, Africa, Asia. Between China and the United States today, you have one of the biggest economic relationships in the world. And secondly, you're not fighting proxy wars anywhere in the world.
And President Xi Jinping made that very clear in Cairo when he was visiting Egypt. China would not fight a turf war, will not have a war for sphere of influence or a proxy war.
So I think we need to be very careful about anyone, whether it's in Beijing or Washington, beginning to say that we're now into a new Lengjian. The Cold War had a completely different set of characteristics. The US-China relationship is phenomenally complex. I'm the first to agree with that. I sit in the middle of it. But it ain't a Cold War, let me tell you, because I'm old enough to remember what that Cold War was like. No, we need new thinking, fresh thinking, in order to, as I said, avoid Thucydides' trap. And that means, in my judgment, to really deepen the economic engagement between the two. If the two economies begin to decouple around technology and other elements of economic engagement, that's when there is a danger of beginning to head in a Cold War direction.
Well, actually, whenever there's a problem or competition between the rising power and the status power, and the world order will be disturbed. And you cannot avoid that. So I mean, the competition between these two powers will definitely to disturb the existing order. And what we should careful about is to prevent the disturbance to the world order from escalating into a war. And I think that's what we must concern or give the priority to. The second is that the disturbance, it doesn't mean that the world will definitely turn back. And through this disturbance of the order, and these two countries possibly can establish a kind of a new order through the balance between these two countries.
Well, I think there is a great deal of misunderstanding between U.S. and China. I even think there's a lot of U.S. misunderstanding of itself. That is, a lot of Americans are stuck in ways of thinking that maybe would have been appropriate 20, 30 years ago, but don't apply anymore. There's been rapid change in the world economy and in technology and so forth. So what you ask is kind of a big, profound question. And I think that in both countries, it's going to be imperative to think clearly and unideologically, to think about what common interests do we have, where are there areas where we could cooperate and achieve mutually beneficial results, and where are some areas where we might just have to disagree, but disagree respectfully, recognizing that each country has its own interests and they may not always be in accord. But that's increasingly hard if you have ideological labels and if you put someone in a box and suggest, well, this is not someone we can deal with, they're this category, that category. Once you start labeling with categories rather than looking for common ground, it's going to be much harder to manage the relationship.
I think that both governments should make more efforts at looking at the other side. But that takes a sensitivity on both sides. So is it possible for us to reach a plateau, another higher level, as we did in 1979 or in 1999 after the WTO? I do believe it is possible, but it will take steps required in Beijing as well as in Washington for us to reach that plateau. I would not understate the challenges either. In 1979, we had the luxury of having a common adversary. And today, we do not have that luxury. But I would note that we have plenty of common adversaries that are perhaps, over the longer term, yet more dangerous than what we faced together in 1979. Certainly, climate change is an enormous challenge for both countries. Controlling disease, pandemic, there are a good number, and I am hopeful that we can begin constructive dialogues yet again on those issues. We have only one world, and China and the United States bear unique responsibilities to our people, to each other, and to the world to get this right.
We move from the center of U.S. politics to the center of U.S. finance. Last year we have a bullish market to foster the presidency of Donald Trump. However, look at the symbol, the bull. I am standing at the heartland of financial capitalism in Wall Street. Hello, Professor Roach.
Great to see you again.
Wall Street is the heart of capitalism, and capitalism, we like to say, is bullish like the bull, but you know, the bull goes up and then sometimes the bull goes away. We never put a bear up there, but you know, markets can go down as well. Capitalism is about risk and about free market allocation of capital. That's a big debate in China right now between the private sector, which is more capitalistic, and the state-owned enterprise sector, which is more state-directed. And I think there's a bull. I've seen it in Shanghai in front of the stock exchange there. I'm not sure it gets quite as much attention in Shanghai as it does in Wall Street.
Steve, I'm not interested in whether we're going to have a bearish or a bullish market in Wall Street. I'm very much interested in why we have this Occupy Wall Street in the wake of the financial meltdown 10 years ago. How do you see, for example, the conflicting role of Wall Street in both creating wealth and opportunities, as well as, for example, a focus of rising inequality and division playing out in the public consciousness today?
Look, you know, we have something in America called creative destruction. And so markets go up and people feel great. Markets go down hard in the type of crisis we had in 08 and 09, and people feel terrible. Occupy Wall Street was about that terrible feeling. And for many Americans, it's still not so great. But the tents are down, and you know, 10 years later, the crisis memories are growing fainter and fainter.
It seems China's fallen victim to the public anger here in Wall Street, because it seems we have stolen the spotlight by allegedly outsourcing American jobs. Let's go there and have a talk about why the general public showed their anger 10 years ago.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Steve, the United States has the world's largest trade deficit. It runs deficit not only with China, but with the EU, Japan, Mexico, and Canada, the two important neighboring countries. So what are the underlying reasons?
Well, this is an issue that's really critical right now in putting the U.S.-China conflict in context. In 2018, the United States had trade deficits on merchandise trade with 102 countries, not just China, which was the largest, but with another 100.
It started to have a trade deficit since the 1970s.
We've had trade deficits every year except one, 1991. And this is a reflection of our shortfall of national or domestic saving. When countries don't save and they want to grow, they import surplus savings from abroad, and they run big balance of payments and multilateral trade deficits with many countries. And so by imposing tariffs on one country, in this case China, without fixing our savings problem, the Chinese piece just will go somewhere else, usually to a higher cost producer, and that will tax American consumers. So we can't fix a multilateral problem with bilateral tariffs. It will not work. Any economists will tell you that, but politicians don't buy the argument because they want to blame one country for our multilateral problem.
Steve, China would happily import more U.S. technology. But the U.S. government continues to view China as a rival instead of a partner in collaboration, and many predict the situation will get worse as the trade war evolves into a technological competition in which the notions of national security shut down further avenues of economic relations. Namely, perhaps more efforts will be made by the U.S. side to decouple and disengage China. Do you think this is very bad, or it's just a technical approach of imposing maximum pressure in the hope of fixing the problem as the pattern of President Trump's behavior?
Look, the battle over innovation, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, this is right at the heart of the structural conflict between our two nations. And the U.S. side views China's progress and commitment to further innovation as an existential threat to our future prosperity, and China views the U.S. actions as an existential threat to the future progress of China on the road to development. I think the lesson from all this is that rhetoric is dangerous and words are cheap. Both countries need to really focus on doing their best to build their technological prowess from within. And from the standpoint of China, this means shifting from a model of importing innovation from other countries, which it's done very actively over the past 40 years, to a model of more homegrown or indigenous innovation. And I think China's making good progress in shifting to indigenous innovation, and the sooner it does that, the better in terms of relieving tensions on this critical issue with the United States. But this requires investing in human capital. It requires investing in its own venture capital and startup structure. It requires powerful startup companies, and China's making good progress in a number of areas there, from e-commerce to biotech, to fintech, and of course to artificial intelligence. So there's good progress, and we in America have to be more accepting of China's ability to achieve this on its own rather than view this as a threat to us.
Steve, we got a conflicting perception about how the U.S. looks at the non-public sector of the Chinese economy. On the one hand, they view remarkable progress and growth of SMEs as a positive sign in examining, whether our economy is progressive or the other way around. On the other hand, taking Huawei as an example, which is flagship enterprise of China's private economy, and yet it has become the target of China bashing campaign. What do you think of what's going on here? What does the U.S. really want?
Well, we have a lot of enemies in the United States, and my take on the tendency of U.S. politicians to blame others, whether they're China or Europe or with Japan in the 1980s. While there may be some truth to some of these concerns, they tend to get exaggerated because of problems that we are unable or unwilling to address at home. It's much more convenient for politicians to have somebody else to blame. I first visited Huawei in the late 1990s. It was a much smaller company, but very committed to advancements on the technological front, and has done a pretty extraordinary job in reaching the envelope of the modern technology frontier and pushing beyond it with its prowess in 5G. This gets back to the U.S. fears that if China succeeds, we might have our own prosperity at risk. I think those fears are overblown. We need to invest in our own technology, our own innovation.
We have a powerful Silicon Valley in
we have
California.
extraordinary breakthroughs on the technological front, and to view Huawei is the mortal threat, well, I think what that does is it avoids the big issue in the U.S., and that is why aren't our companies competing as successfully at 5G as Huawei is?
Thank you very much, Steve. I do appreciate your articulation of China's problems and the challenges we both face in shaping the future of a commonwealth.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you.
Philadelphia was a historical center of the young United States, and it's still a vibrant center of learning for young people today. We spoke with several students from the University of Pennsylvania to get their views. Okay guys, welcome to our special program. I like the location of the Pennsylvania University, so what benefits could you have from the international vision that the university seeks to share with the young students here? With you being an example, you look like a Chinese, but where are you from?
I was born in Shanghai, and then we moved to Canada when I was 6, so I grew up in Canada, but I also go back to China a lot, and I do a lot of literary translation, so I know Chinese and English very well.
But can you speak Mandarin?
Yeah, very well. I can.
But can you read?
I can read. No, I can write.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you know about China?
I know that it's the largest country in the world by population. It's an emerging economy. It's on all the headlines all the time recently. And
good headlines or bad headlines?
Well, it's a mix. It depends on what perspective you take, I guess, and where you read them, in what country. But I don't view them as good or bad headlines, just headlines, I think.
You're from South Africa. We have developed a very good relationship with Johannesburg, Cape Town, and with your country. President Formosa, however, delivered a mixed feeling about China. But what do you know about China? Does the rise of China carry negative or positive implications globally?
I think in terms of Africa, it's a complicated question. What it comes down to is increasing economic opportunity for Africans through building infrastructure and the rest of it. But, you know, as we say, they're good headlines and bad headlines, but it's a sign of a superpower.
It doesn't come as a surprise that the U.S. government keeps a low profile in commemorating the 40th anniversary of a bilateral relationship, given their mistrust about the intent of China's pursuit of 5G and the intent of Huawei, the ambitions of this Titanic image. What do you think of, say, fears of Americans and American policymakers about our kind of a leadership, not fully to that point yet, but what do you think of their fears?
For me personally, at least, the U.S.-China relations is really important, just because growing up in both cultures, I really want there to be more communication, more cooperation. I think the biggest issue about the misconceptions that Western media may have of China and vice versa is because we come from very different types of cultures, of different types of governments.
So the two countries are very different one from another. Therefore, naturally, we have the deep-rooted misunderstanding. After 40 years of engagement, do you think they're going to say goodbye to China to decouple the Chinese market? Is that an easy job?
No, I think because China comes from a very collectivist culture and America is very individualistic, so we have a lot of inherent similarities, as Max Baucus was talking about in the opening ceremony of the War in China Summit. But I think that these differences, similarities are still built on some substantial differences that we need to learn how to reconcile in order to understand each other better. And I think it comes a lot from understanding the motivations of each other and where each other stand, and if there is more communication regarding.
China is an important part of the global supply chain in terms of digital technology. One leading article of The Economist, a prestigious journal, says what happens between the two biggest economies is actually battles for digital leadership. For you guys who grew up more on the keyboard, drinking Coca-Cola, I mean, what does digital technology mean for the future of mankind? Does it necessarily invite a kind of a rivalry between the two biggest markets? So what are your thoughts?
Well, I did grow up drinking Coca-Cola and playing everything and on Facebook and whatever. And of course, technology is going to be a big part of the world in the future and of the economy. I mean, AI emerging and things like this is going to be decisive in the future of economics. But for me, it's not important whether technology comes from China or if it comes from the United States. That's the thing about having an outside perspective, you know, not being from the United States. For us, having China emerging as an economy just provides more opportunity for us around the world. While for Americans, with China emerging, with Huawei, for instance, I just purchased like a MateBook Huawei, very nice computer. Americans, they are more, for them, everything that China does is threatening their standing, right? For the outside world, what China does is just creating more opportunity for us. And I think it's great that China is so innovative with technological changes, and you can see in the society that they're like far ahead of most of the world with leading technological innovation.
I would disagree to some extent. I do think that it does matter to everyone where the new technological advances are coming from, because it has a lot to do with data collection, and who collects that data and what they do with it is obviously subject to the internal policies of the country. If it's US companies, what they do with the data might be very different to what Chinese companies might do with that data. So I think in a large part those technological movements are fanning the flames of what was already a somewhat tense relationship between these two superpowers. But I don't think it's unfounded. I do think it does matter.
Some renowned scholars from University of Pennsylvania say that the rhetoric on Chinese industrial espionage to discredit Huawei is a part of a propaganda in the competition for digital leadership. Do you think what they say does make sense? Or do you think this smacks of geopolitical rivalry? Your younger generation don't care so much about geopolitical rivalry. You just look at the convenience that digital technology brings about.
I think that it is perhaps for younger generations more about the convenience. Increasingly it's becoming more about the companies and the governments, particularly in the United States with the way that they're legislating these massive tech companies. It's really down to what the companies themselves are doing rather than the government. Obviously in China it's a little bit different. The government has a bit more swing with the big Chinese companies, but you know, that might change as well.
In sensitive areas about scientific research in the United States, Chinese scholars and students are increasingly prevented by the US government for fear that we understand. Do you think a university like Pennsylvania would share the same concern when it comes to the free flow of human resources, free exchange of students and scholars? Do you think this threatens to be an obstacle given the uncertainty of the President Trump's policy? What do you think of the policy of attracting international students without being jeopardized by politics?
I think that I would be quite concerned if it did affect something like the University of Pennsylvania's view on it. I think the American universities should concentrate on getting foreign students. They should be very open to foreign students, regardless of where they come from. Particularly in this country where it's based on individual values, no student should suffer because of some geopolitical consequence.
If I may, today I believe the Chinese international students make up 30% of the international student body of American universities. So there's a quite substantial amount of Chinese students in American universities today. And I do not hope that that will change in the future, because I think just by having two countries that are so different, two worlds apart, you could say, having two economies that are in 10 years probably going to be an equal size and going to be competing in some ways, this relationship that we develop here in universities where Western students meet Eastern students is extremely important, I think, for future diplomatic relationships.
So, shall we say together, yes we can, right?
Yes we can.
Our week-long trip to the United States was concluded in Philadelphia, where we talked to students who represent the future and perhaps the silver lining of a very difficult relationship.